It's the Star of the Masquerade on this episode of NES Works Gaiden. Last week, we looked at Dojin publisher Columbus Circle's surprising but welcome decision to bring a formerly digital-only release to retail 2 decades after its original debut, preventing the game from being lost to the ages. This week we have a similar venture, this time on the American side of the fence. Retro Bit Entertainment, primarily known to this point for its authorized clone consoles containing a kitchen sink approach to licensing, has decided to step into the reprint retro cartridge space. The company published a few oddball Super NES and NES cartridges late last year, compilations of previously issued titles from Data East and JEKYLL. This week's Retrobit releases are a little different. For one thing, they're from IREM, a company that has been a lot less liberal with licensing than D4, which is the holding company that owns the rights to Data East and JEKYLL's libraries. And secondly, these new releases feel a lot more meaningful than the grab bag approach of Retrobit's previous carts and multi-consoles. Rather than dumping half a dozen or more second-stream games into a single cart or emulator box, this week we have 3 noteworthy games spread across 2 carts, each gussied up in over-the-top collector's editions, both of which Retrobit has provided for review. The deluxe packaging on these looks and feels great, and all the extras are nice if you're into that sort of thing. But it's not the real value of these sets. No, what makes these truly remarkable is that they represent properly licensed efforts to reprint games that until now have been either scarce or difficult to acquire legally in the US. On the Super NES front, we have a Super NES R-Type compilation that contains both of IREM's R-Type releases for that console, Super R-Type and R-Type 3 The Third Lightning. We looked at Super R-Type back in an early episode of Super NES Works, and it's fine. It's a decent action game with a great soundtrack. Super R-Type makes for a decent recombinant version of R-Type and R-Type 2, though it does suffer from some bothersome slowdown, as has been the case for nearly all first-wave Super NES action games. As a game, it's okay. As an original retail release, the original Super NES cart remains a pretty common and inexpensive pickup. R-Type 3, on the other hand, has a reputation for being an exceptional take on R-Type designed specifically for the Super NES hardware. And it comes with the price tag to match. An authentic bare cart sells for something like $120 or $150 these days. And the complete boxed game is the sort of thing retro gaming convention vendors put on their top shelf in the hopes that someone will bite and pay next month's rent for them. So this double game cart is pretty close to being a perfect example of retro reissues done right. It packs 2 good shooters into a single cart and makes a hard-to-find game more accessible, legitimately, for people with an interest in playing it on original hardware, all while still appearing in a distinct enough format that collectors don't have to worry about their extremely expensive original copies suddenly being devalued. It's a shame Retrobit hasn't made it available in a non-premium release to go along with the overstuffed box edition, but even so, $60 is a fraction of what R-Type 3 alone sells for these days. Anyway, the R-Type collection isn't the real marvel in this batch of releases. No, that honor goes to Holy Diver for NES. It's all well and good to reissue a game that already made its way to US retail, but Holy Diver is something much more remarkable. It's an official US region release of a Famicom game that has never before reached the States. Granted, this is one of those terse Famicom games that requires no real localization for the game text, but here it's been given an NES-style box and manual, all in English. Holy Diver has had a solid reputation among Western Famicom fans for nearly 3 decades now, and understandably so. It's an extremely import-friendly game requiring no particular language skill to play. After all, as we've seen with the likes of Super Ghouls and Ghosts, abject suffering is the universal language. Yes, this is a crushingly difficult game, as one would expect from 80s IREM. At least the game leans into its extreme difficulty level and just absolutely owns it. Right off the bat, you can see what you're getting into. Your protagonist, a dude named Randy, was clearly stamped from the 8-bit Belmont mold. The game around him matches. Now, there were a lot of games in the NES days that looked at the CASTLEVANIA series and said, oh yes, we'll do that too. Most of them were, let's be honest, not so great. Kinsaiden and Vampire Master of Darkness were okay, I guess, but frankly the less said about 8 Eyes, the better. Holy Diver belongs to this grand tradition of totally ripping off Castlevania, and it does a much better job of it than most. You definitely get the feeling that Irem's dev team took careful notes while playing Castlevania. Then they played Haunted Castle. Then they said, no, these games are much too easy. Let's make our players cry. You know how Castlevania is deliberate in its pacing and demands thoughtful movements and careful choices at every turn? Holy Diver takes that approach and plays it at double speed. This game plays like Castlevania on a coke bender. You need look no further than the second leg of the game's first stage to see the truth of this. While fighting against slow, hovering enemies that pause momentarily out of striking distance before darting down to attack, poor Randy also has to face off against infinite streams of bizarre skulled butterflies that behave a lot like Medusa heads that have been genetically engineered to take the most frustrating foes in Castlevania and make them even more ruthlessly antagonistic. These, Sculptorflies initially seem to behave like Castlevania's Medusa heads. They fly in a sine wave pattern centered around whatever Randy's vertical position happens to be at the moment they spawn at the edge of the screen. They move faster and spawn more rapidly than Medusa heads, but that's okay because Randy is also more mobile and can rapid fire his short-range energy bursts. But then you let a Sculptorfly slip past you and the damn thing turns around and zips in the opposite direction in a straight line. Worse, Sculptorflies spawn in the direction Randy's currently facing, so if you turn around to take down a stray, you'll suddenly be facing these monsters from both directions. Medusa heads were nasty because their tricky patterns tend to knock Belmonts into yawning chasms or beds of spikes. These things are nasty because they're just plain nasty. And that's the entire game in a nutshell. You come across something that feels familiar, and then a few seconds later, it reveals some unexpected horrible twist, and then suddenly you're at the game over screen, selecting continue. Or maybe just sobbing in a corner. Still, even if Holy Diver is unrepentantly vicious, it comes by its difficulty somewhat reasonably. A lot of the insanely challenging 8-bit games of this type tended to be so vexing because they suffered from stiff controls or unresponsive mechanics. Now, you won't mistake Randy here for like Mario or something, but he does feel properly matched to the world he inhabits. Unlike some protagonists, he can jump high and alter his trajectory mid-leap. He can fire energy bursts rapidly, and he doesn't crumple like tissue paper after taking a single hit. This is no Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde or 8 Eyes, in other words. Randy also has a limited resource working in his favor as well, an alternate attack format that drains his mana but hits a lot harder than his standard attacks. By tapping the select key, Randy will switch to his blue alt attack mode, which initially allows him to fire off double strength energy waves. These drain through his mana pretty quickly, and the mana recharge drops enemies sometimes leave behind are pretty meager. So the power wave is definitely something to use with caution and only when necessary. As you advance through the game, you earn additional magical powers. These tend to be even more expensive in terms of mana than the standard twin fire wave attack, but they're also quite powerful. On top of that, they play a role in navigating the stages. For example, you need the Blizzard spell to freeze pools of magma in Stage 2, which can be a hassle if you don't conserve your magic and are forced to grind up enough mana refills in order to use the spell again. But if you can manage to find it, there's a special item in the game called the Wizard Staff that halves the cost of your magic attacks. It's one of a number of items scattered throughout the game. Randy enjoys the benefit of a full inventory system despite this being a brief 6-level linear game. Of course, given how long it can take to progress past the various extreme difficulty walls you encounter along the way, it kind of makes sense for Holy Diver to include an upgrade system akin to a more complex game. This isn't the sort of action title you settle in with for a leisurely cruise to the final boss. It's a grinding, grueling, unforgiving taskmaster of a game that punishes you for making even the slightest mistake. Still, you can't say Holy Diver doesn't make its intentions clear right at the beginning. The game's title comes from a Dio album, and there's a real heavy metal mindset about the entire thing. It's dark, angry, and intense from the very beginning, and the story is crammed with references to Satan and heavy metal bands ranging from King Crimson to Slayer. Even Randy's name sounds an awful lot like Ronnie, as in Ronnie James Dio. With its satanic references and black metal vibe, it's only fitting that Holy Diver poses a hellish challenge. It seems like the kind of thing that would be fun to break out at parties, to force that one guy who's so insufferable about how good he is at Neo and Dark Souls, and how everyone else is a scrub to play, so everyone can watch him be humbled by a game from 3 decades ago. In any case, as with R-Type 3, this is a welcome modern-day release from Retrobit. Holy Diver never came to the US. Irem's plans for localization fell through, probably because Nintendo of America's strict content policies made them take one look at the video game equivalent of a heavy metal album cover and say, no. Thanks to its limited release and high desirability for importers, the vintage Famicom cartridge of Holy Diver alone sells for more than Retrobit is asking for this box set reissue. And don't even ask about a boxed copy of the Famicom game. In short, both Holy Diver and the R-Type pack amount to another very welcome, modern-day attempt to push back against the disappearance of hard-to-find classic games, done up with sufficient style to make these new releases desirable for collectors and reasonably affordable for people who just want to get their hands on the games. Retrobit appears to be testing the waters with these two collector sets, and I'll be curious to see what rarities the future holds if more of these make their way down the line. For now, though, I'm going to continue the desperate fight to get past Stage 2 of Holy Diver.